Thanks for tuning in to the Bold Lines podcast. I am your host, Travis Thompson. Today we're going to be talking about systems theory and how to interpret family dynamics. Systems theory is incredibly important to me as a therapist and as a researcher because it helps give understanding and definition to how individuals interact in their environment. Systems theory is incredibly important when working with couples and families. It's also important outside of therapy because in my own life, it helps me understand how I interact with other people, whether that's a social or a familial setting. So let me give you an idea of where systems theory comes from. Systems theory actually begins in biology, not psychology. It came from this observation of ecosystems and how all of the different parts interact with one another. This comes from how rain affects grass growth and how that grass growth affects how things like deer, how they grow and they shrink in population, as well as how predators intervene on these deer populations. One of the things that became incredibly apparent when looking at systems theory is the idea that instead of just looking at the individual factors of what makes something like a deer population surge or decline, it made way more sense to see everything in context. You couldn't just look at one thing or another and assume that had all of the impact on it. The phrase that's often used for this is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This is, in simple terms, it's saying that you can categorize everything. You can map out how you think those few things interact with those around it, but without seeing the entire picture, you're going to lose the meaning. So that's where this begins. I'll give you one of my favorite understandings of this. If you didn't know, and I live in America for those listeners that are outside of the US, and one of the things that is important to know about American history is how pilgrims and how homesteaders moved west and started to change the landscape of the United States. One of the things that is important to know in terms of ecosystems and human migration is when humans move, they tend to kick out predators because they prefer not to die. I think that's a worthwhile reason to kick predators out. But one of the things that resulted from humans moving west and industrializing and spreading out their population was that not only were those predators pushed away, they were killed and even kept away. Now, in the Midwest, this has been an incredibly impactful thing. I was talking about deer earlier, and I think this is a really great place to understand systems theory. With the wolves kicked out, with the deer left with no natural predators, their population exploded. Well, initially that sounds great, except when you look at the entire ecosystem, it's not good for prey to have no natural predators because then they take up too many resources and the sickly, the animals that should be dying off or the ones that tend to get left behind continue on. You get less resilient deer and you get a devastation of local plant life, which again affects everything else. Interestingly enough, humans also came up with a solution to the problem that they caused. It's called hunting. So, in an effort to balance this ecosystem, and also because hunting's fairly cheap if you know how to do it, we can actually help save an ecosystem. We can help balance the whole system without natural predators by going hunting. This idea of balancing out this system is called homeostasis. Homeostasis, basically defined as just how everything interacts with one another and keeps everything the same. So as hunting is up, the deer are stable. If the deer all of a sudden decline and the hunting doesn't change, then the deer will decline to a dangerous level. And in an effort to curb that, hunting would have to decrease. So everything comes back to level. So this is great and all. Now you have this very wonderful understanding of the Midwestern ecosystem and the problems and the solutions that humans have brought. What on earth does this have to do with families? If you can understand this previous concept, you can start to apply it to families in themselves. Now, for whatever listener decides to be a little bit sarcastic, no, I'm not saying that in order to have a healthy family system, you have to go hunting or kick out certain children into Canada. That's not at all what I'm saying. What these Midwestern ecosystems have done, though, is they provided a framework for researchers and psychologists to begin to understand family units. No man is an island. No woman is an island either. And especially no child is an island. And in a family system, when one member influences the system, everybody else is affected. Big or small, whatever changes we make inside of ourselves affect everyone around us. This is easily seen when children come to me in therapy. And I see this child whose parents are often rightly concerned about their behavior. And it would be very easy to look at that child as something as simple as a deer population. There's a problem. Let's fix it. But the problem with that thinking is that if I were to just treat a child without seeing the entire family system, I've violated homeostasis. And I have missed, and this is kind of ironic, I've missed the forest for the trees. You can see this plainly, even outside of therapy, when you look at a child and you wonder how they got that way, and then you meet the parents and you don't wonder anymore. This is how family systems work. Everybody influences one another. Let's take extreme circumstances. Like, let's say mom's an alcoholic. Is her drinking going to affect the family? Oh, you betcha. But is the child's reaction going to affect the family? Absolutely. Sure, when mom drinks, it affects the kid's sense of self and safety. When a kid starts to shame his mom, of course, it's going to affect her as well. And what about dad? As he watches this whole interaction play out, it's going to affect him as well. That's an extreme example, but I'll give you something even a little more simple. Let's say that two parents are fighting or are in a rough spot. One thing that can tend to happen is they begin to emotionally distance from one another. And it's pretty typical to see something like that. Well, the thing is their arguments, their discontent, are not just affecting them. If they have children, their children are going to pick up on the tension. Now, they're going to feel that something's wrong, but they're not going to have context. And so, like all children, they're going to assume that it has something to do with them. It's not because they're necessarily self-centered, but that's just how children think. So when mom and dad are fighting and are distant from one another, the child starts to blame himself or herself. And then that affects the family. Maybe the parents start to see that isolation as a problem and overfocus on the child. Or maybe they see that child's isolation as resiliency or independence. And so they further drive that child into isolation by continuing to enforce or encourage that kind of behavior. I hope by this point you can kind of understand what I mean when I say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Everybody interacts with one another. We always affect everybody. This even is true in small things. Let's say that dad has a little secret, right? Let's say dad has a history of porn use and he thinks that it doesn't affect anybody. Surely it's just about him, right? Nobody else knows. No harm, no foul, right? Unfortunately, systems theory, it's not quite how it works. So follow this line of logic with me. So dad has a history of porn use. That is going to detach him from his wife. Because if he's getting a need met outside of his marriage, he's not going to be as attached to her. And that distance is going to create some sort of insecurity. And insecurity is obviously going to cause anxiety or stress. And when anxiety and stress is kept between the parents, the kid's going to suffer. So even those little secrets that everybody thinks that they have that aren't going to affect anybody else, yeah, thinking it only affects you is a bunch of garbage. The only way it wouldn't affect anyone else is if you were born on an island to no parents, you never spoke to anyone, and there was no record of you. That is the only way your behavior won't affect anyone else. I mean, except for when somebody comes and visits the island and saw that there was life there. Yes, this is getting ridiculous, but you have to understand that none of our behavior is isolated. Is this good for therapy? Yes, obviously. Even little interactions I see in family sessions, those little reactions that people have, the facial expressions, the tone that they use, of course it affects everybody else in the room. Let's look at outside of therapy. What does systems theory have to tell us? Well, in systems theory, there's some basic understandings of how things work. One is it's really easy to pick a scapegoat that everybody can gang up on. Whether that scapegoat is identified by the family unit or is just naturally happened upon, in systems theory, it's likely that somebody gets the blame because it's easier. A lot of times that's the kid. Sometimes it's a parent or maybe it's a grandparent or somebody else. But I'd ask you to consider in your own life, is there a quote unquote bad guy in your family? Is it you? If it is you, maybe you have earned that terrible badge of honor. But okay, so maybe you did more than one thing that could be considered wrong. Systems theory, the problem is, are other people piling on it? Why do you have that label? Why is it that you see yourself as a villain? Is that something that's gone on for a while? Systems theory isn't just about a single moment. It's about a period of time. I told you I lived in Middle Tennessee, and there are two events, ecologically speaking, that have had lasting impacts in this area. Number one, there was a tornado that came through some years ago. And what I once saw in a greenway was a whole bunch of trees and a ton of shade, and it was quite beautiful. Problem is, when that tornado came through, things were pulled up and it was no longer the same. That ecosystem had been forever changed by the tornado that blew through. You know, thinking back now, as I'm sitting here recording this, that event still affects me. As I'm sitting here thinking about calling people, making sure they're okay, and helping people get what remains of their home into boxes so they can find a place to go, of course it still affects me. Of course, when there's a tornado warning, I get concerned because I've seen what could happen. That impact on me certainly affects the way that I parent. It affects the way that I interact with my wife. Because in systems, no one's ever isolated and it's never about a single moment. But systems theory expands beyond just intimate relationships. Let's think about things like work. If you're in an office with a whole bunch of people, that's a system. You better believe it. When one employee does something, it affects others. Is that because they're somehow this all-powerful being? No, that's just how life works. This is very easily seen with bosses that are either engaged or disengaged. An engaged boss, of course, is going to help create a system that flourishes. Somebody who is willing to be open and excited about the job and supportive, of course, it's going to affect the system. Except for when you get that one bad apple that can't seem to get fired for the life of them. That's going to affect the system. It's going to affect how other employees work. And even if you have an amazing boss, the one employee that can't seem to get fired, no matter how many times they screw up, it's going to affect the system. It poisons it, obviously. A lot of us would like to think, especially here in the West, that we are completely individuals and our voice is the most important. Sorry to say for anyone who hasn't come to the correct conclusion yet, but everybody is a part of a system, whether we like it or not. Our responsibility to that system is up for debate, but to pretend that we are only ourselves and nobody can influence us or tell us what to do is a bunch of garbage. It's not human nature. We're social creatures. Of course we can be impacted. Back to the job thing, let's imagine that there's a big shakeup in the company, even if it doesn't directly affect a department. Of course, that's going to affect how people interact with one another. Maybe they start to wonder if there's downsizing or if someone's going to get fired or maybe something's getting shaken up. Of course, everything's in a system. That's just how humans work. Let's think about how we interpret this in ourselves, in our personal or professional lives, but especially in the family. The first thing that's going to be important is to try to take a third-person perspective as much as possible. That can mean that you try to be objective or you ask someone that you think is wise about the situation. But try to step back and see how everything plays into one another. Once you can see how everyone affects each other through slights in conversation, through off-putting comments or support or something completely random, you could start to see how the whole system interacts with one another. When you can start to look at it objectively, you can start to understand where your place is in it. It's very likely that even in the scenarios that you don't like, the family systems, the work systems, whatever it is, you are helping maintain homeostasis. You're helping keeping everything in balance. I've seen this with clients who come in and tell me about how much they feel unsupported in work. And then in the next breath, they tell me about how they're overworking themselves to pick up the slack. That is absolutely homeostasis. Boss is disconnected. You feel a sense of purpose and meaning and trying to make things right. You're trying to write a system of the past, but also a system of the present. Let's go to family systems. This is where things get a little more tense. How does everybody interact with one another? Are there good guys and bad guys? Have people earned those roles or were they bestowed upon them? Were children given ideas or places within the family that were inappropriate? Did the parents take appropriate responsibility for their actions? Are things spoken about, or are they spoken under bated breath or not talked about at all? I mean, something as simple as the secret that we all keep can affect decades. Now, using systems theory isn't a way to attack other people, because if you are in a system and you've been in it for decades, chances are you're contributing to it if you haven't removed yourself already. Too many times I've heard clients say that they can't stand a situation or it's draining them. And then I ask them how long it's been going on, and they say years. And then I respond with, "Are you sure you hate it? Are you sure you can't stand it? You might dislike it. It might make you uncomfortable, but you're helping maintain it." Now, please hear me here. I'm not asking anyone listening to say, "Oh, wow, I don't like my family. Time to completely disconnect." Not in the slightest. That's not what I'm saying. Just like the ecosystems that I was talking about earlier, you can shift the way that families interact. If you are the truth teller in the family, chances are people have looked to you to help make sense of things. Start to be curious about what happens if you don't tell the truth anymore, if you take a step back from understanding everything and helping other people solve their own problems. If you are contributing to the negative interaction in the family unit, evaluate yourself. If you're the cause of a lot of the negativity, it can't be just you, though. Other people have allowed it to some degree. Unless they're children, they've allowed it to happen. If you have come to the right conclusion that I'm right, that everybody lives within a system, and those systems directly impact all of the members, no matter who's in it, then it's time for you to consider what you can do to write your own way, how you can speak up. Now, not everybody's going to be able to speak up. If you're an entry-level worker in a job that is overwhelming, chances are your voice isn't going very far. Keep the emotional engagement to where you're at within a system. If you are a distant member of a family, it's not your job to step in and make things right. You should accurately assess how much sway you have and how much you should have. If you can see a hope for change, do it drastically. If I were to take that deer population and decide, oh my gosh, there are too many. Everyone from everywhere can go hunt deer to make it better. Well, that ecosystem is going to be worse than it ever was. In fact, when it comes to Midwestern ecosystems, one of the things that conservationists are doing to fix it is reintroducing wolf populations. Again, they can't chuck 10 dozen wolves into the ecosystem. It'll wreck it. It has to be done gradually. And also people like to hunt, so you can't completely redo it. But in your own family system, you're going to need gradual work. You're going to need time to slowly introduce ideas or concepts. If you are making a change, there's something to be warned about. Depending on how volatile or strained the system is, it's going to affect the way that they respond to your sense of change. Because homeostasis isn't just about everybody keeping things balanced, it's also about enforcing other people's roles. So if you see that you're in a family system where sickness is upheld and people will keep secrets from one another and offload their problems onto someone else, chances are when you speak up, there will be revulsion, backlash. People will get angry. That's okay. It's to be expected. But understand that if a family system has been operating on the same homeostasis for 3 or 4 decades, chances are your one conversation, your one set up boundary isn't going to change things. Everybody can have a fluke. Everybody can speak up now and again. If you want real change to happen, if you're a parent, if you're a family member, to some degree, if you're a child, that's an adult child, hopefully. I really hope no 5-year-olds listening to this at this point. But if you're an adult child, measure how much you can engage. See what you can do and take your time. Honor what you need. Part of the problem in the family system might be that other people sap the energy that you give. The problem could also be the other way around, where you sap so much energy from other people that they have nothing left for themselves. That might be hard to hear, but if it's that hard to hear, you shouldn't come sit with me in therapy. After hearing all of this, I hope that you're starting to pay attention to how you interact and how others interact. Know that when someone speaks to you, they have multiple systems that are playing in their head, even if they're not a part of them. When someone's interacting with you, there's systems from your past that are playing a role. There are systems from your present that are playing a role. Because you can't just take someone in a single moment and assume that that present time is all that's affecting them. If anything, I hope that you've heard all of this today and started to become curious about how family members interact with one another, that maybe one person is identified as the sick one, but others are maintaining or ignoring it. That maybe the bad guy in the family is just a punching bag and isn't actually the villain. It's just easier to blame someone and they've taken on that role. Maybe you've taken on stress that isn't yours to bear. Or maybe your own stress or strain has been put off on other people. If any of those are true for you, I hope that you take a step back and speak to someone about it. It doesn't have to be a therapist, but just someone who has healthy family systems, or they're trying very, very hard to make it that way. Evaluate and see where you're at and see if it's worth making a change. Thank you for listening today. I hope that you gain some knowledge that could be useful, something that could be supportive to you, a loved one, family member, whoever it is. And I hope that you could find something that could change a small part of you that can make a difference for the future. If you feel so inclined, you can leave something in the tip jar. Perfectly fine if not. If not, though, I do hope that you subscribe to the podcast and share this with other people so that they can find healing for themselves as well.